Welcome. This is going to be an abbreviated version of an article I wrote about domestic violence. You can find the link up there in that corner. At any rate, I found this article on the web. The headline was, how did it go? 1 in 5 men admits to being violent against their spouse. I thought, wow, that's quite a few. But then I thought, yeah, but that's pretty typical. I mean, most of the research we've seen on domestic violence has focused on male perpetrators and female victims, so it didn't really surprise me so much. But I looked on the web, and what did I find? I found article after article after article that had this headline. You know, 1 in 5 males is violent against their spouse. 1 in 5 males is guilty of domestic violence against their loved one. I mean, just over and over again. It's almost like these articles were sort of gleeful in finding that these men were actually 20% of men were actually doing this. So it struck me that this was becoming pretty commonplace. I mean, it was just all over the media. So I thought, let me write the researcher. So I wrote to the lead researcher, and he was a really nice guy. And we wrote back and forth a number of times, and he said some things that really started to help me understand the mentality of researchers in domestic violence. Because before this, I'd kind of not understood, and now I understand a little bit better. Maybe not so much, but a little bit better. And he said some things that shocked me in some ways. When I asked him, "Did you ask females the same question about their violence towards males?" It took him a while to get to me, or to get to that answer to the question. But he said, "As I'd like physicians to think about asking men about IPV, interpersonal violence, a place to start is from the traditional heterosexual model of women as victims and men as perpetrators. Eventually, physicians may get to the point of asking women about perpetration and men about victimization. The medical community is not there yet and may not be there for many years." So I thought, wow, he's thinking that we need to start with women and just put the men off. The medical community may get there years from now. I mean, this is the mentality. And it just sort of shocked me. I was like, whoa, that's just, it's like he was putting men on the back burner. Can you imagine that a doctor saying, hey, we have lots of diabetes. Let's start with the white victims, since that's where most physicians are comfortable. Maybe someday we'll get to the blacks. That would not go over very well at all. But if you do it with men, somehow it works. That's pretty crazy, eh? Then another response to the same question about, why did you ask women about things? He says the old thing about women being victims more often. And he says this: though women may report higher rates of perpetration, they receive more injuries from IPV. And women constitute 70% of those killed by an intimate partner. Because of the greater burden of injuries and deaths from interpersonal violence, we chose to focus on men as aggressors in our study. Okay, so because the women were victims more often in his mind, they thought it was important to only look at male perpetrators. That doesn't add up in my book. In fact, if you look at the research on domestic violence, over the years, the Archer meta-analysis, for instance, showed that 38% of the victims of domestic violence, the injured victims, were males. So I don't buy this idea that it's so many more women, nor do I buy the idea that because of that we should only study the male perpetrators. It just doesn't add up. But see, this is the way he was kind of thinking about things, and it told me a little bit more about the way he was sort of rationalizing things. And then the last thing he said about this was, there's no effective intervention for male victims of interpersonal violence or female perpetrators of interpersonal violence. Without an intervention, physicians don't want to ask men or women about those behaviors. Your point that many domestic violence services agencies not wanting to work with men also complicates this issue. Okay, now wait a minute. He's saying that female perpetrators and male victims don't have interventions. And because they don't have interventions, we should just not pay attention to them? That doesn't add up in my book. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, should we, if I were to ask him, there's a whole group of researchers who are afflicted by this particular problem, but they don't have any intervention. Do you think that he would just ignore them? No, of course not. If it was his family, same thing. I mean, for some reason, see, it's easy to go along with the gynocentric idea, which is, the gynocentric idea is the world is built to protect women. And that's kind of what overrides these three responses is he's kind of going along with the gynocentric idea of the world is about protecting women. And so therefore domestic violence should be about men as perpetrators and women as victims. But let's look at the study itself here for just a second. Those were just ideas about what he thought about why he only chose to look at the male side of things. But let's look at the actual study. And it was really, really interesting stuff. You know, first off, they used a public database for the research. And I asked the guy for the database numbers of women who had admitted to hitting men or been violent towards men. And he hemmed and hawed and said, well, no, he couldn't do that, and that I really need a statistician in order to figure that out. Well, you probably know from my previous YouTubes that I'm not going to take that. So I found the data online. And in fact, it's searchable online. And I started tearing it apart and looking at it. And wow, what I found is just amazing. The first thing is they used two questions for this research. And the two questions were about interpersonal violence. And each question had four possible responses: never, rarely, sometimes, and often. Okay. And if you look at the chart below, you'll see that the summary of all their responses for these two questions, the never was 2,045 people. The rarely was 399. The sometimes was 56, and the often was 4. That's both men and women responding. So the vast majority of people said never. A small minority said rarely, and very few said sometimes, and almost no one said often. So this gives us some ideas about these two questions. It tells us the frequency of the responses. But here's what happened. What did the researchers do? They looked at these responses and they dumbed down the data. They said, okay, we're going to count never as a no vote and rarely, sometimes, and often as a yes vote. So by doing that, they completely camouflage the idea that most people say rarely. And they then have these two numbers, and they that's the 1 in 5 piece. But they don't tell you that it was most people saying, rarely did I commit domestic violence, rarely did I threaten my spouse. So they leave some very important things out. And by leaving that information out, they did something very important. They gave themselves the license to say 1 in 5 men admits to domestic violence against their spouse. Because if they had not dumbed that data down like that, they would have had to have said 1 in 5 men admits to rarely committing domestic violence against his spouse. See how it works? So, the way they've dumbed down the data does a couple of things. One, it keeps people from being able to see any information about the frequency of the data. And two, it camouflages the data so that it looks like, well, maybe a lot of people, 1 in 5 men admit to domestic violence. How about that? But let's go ahead and look at the actual questions they asked, which are telling also. The first question was about minor violence, and it reads like this. People handle disagreements in many different ways. Over the course of your relationship, how often have you ever done any of these things on list A to your spouse or partner? Often, sometimes, rarely, or never. And the list is pushed, grabbed, shoved, threw something, slapped, hit, or spanked. Okay. And you can see the chart down here that shows us the men's responses and the women's responses. And I want you to look carefully at this. Both men and women, there are about 1,000 men, about 1,000 women. But look, more women said rarely, 232 versus 167. And a lot more women said sometimes, 38 to 18. And 3 times as many women said often, 3 to 1. Okay. Now, this is kind of important data, don't you think? And by not putting that into the research, I mean, it's like they're telling only one sliver of the story, one slight piece of the story that does not tell the whole thing. This data starts to tell us the whole thing about minor violence, at any rate. This question is about minor violence, push or shove. And think about it, a push or shove. I mean, it could be that someone got pushed or shoved and they say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And that was that. But you see, a push out of irritation and an immediate getting better after that in the relationship would be counted as an incident of domestic violence. So again, that's kind of skewing the data a little bit more. But let's look at the next question. The next question was about the severe violence. And it reads like this. Now looking at list B, over the course of your relationship, how often have you ever done any of the things on list B to your spouse partner? Often, sometimes, rarely, or never. Now let's look at the data and look at this chart from list B for all the responses. And what you find is very many fewer people responded positively to this question about severe violence. So 33 women and 25 men said rarely. That's out of 1,200, 1,100 responses. 5 women and 2 men said sometimes. 3 women and 0 men said often. Okay, that gives us some pretty important information about this data and about this question. But here's what they did. The researchers combined not only the frequency numbers, they combined the severity numbers too, so that they combined the severe and the minor violence. So we know from looking at this data now that a tiny fraction of the people who said they were violent in relationship were actually admitting severe violence. Very small portion, 1 in 7, I think it is. But when they combine all this data to one yes or no answer, you can't tell that. You don't know that. You don't know if the violence was severe or whether it was minor or anything else. So it leaves you not knowing. It leaves you dumbed down in some ways. And it also leaves the reader of the research thinking, oh boy, that's a lot of violence. That's a lot of men being violent. So it's pretty suspect in some ways, if you ask me. Okay, we've seen how the ideas and attitudes of the researcher played out in only reporting one side of the story. We've seen how the dichotomizing of the data, that is, making it a yes or no, basically dumbed things down and made it much less useful. We've also seen how very shocking and informative data that conclusively shows that women admitted to being more violent in relationship was ignored and unreported. This all facilitates the promotion of the default narrative of women as victims and men as perpetrators by only telling the story about male perpetrators and female victims. We've seen how this works and the powerful national media's willingness to promote this half the story on a national level. Now look at this headline. Now you know this headline should actually read, 1 in 4 American women admit to domestic violence. Can you imagine seeing an article like the one pictured here in a mainstream media publication? I would bet not. But like it or not, that's actually the truth. It's time we started holding researchers, the media, and all those connected to domestic violence accountable. The charade has gone on far too long. And let's not forget, men are good.